Okay, this week we are talking about assessment. So let's jump right in. So our agenda for this video is in part formative versus summative assessment, formal versus informal assessment, and performance assessment. You can see there are many kinds of assessment, right? So to begin, when we look at the two main types of assessment, we have formative and we have summative. Formative assessment is assessment for learning. That's how I like to remember. Formative, it's got for in there. But look at the purpose. The purpose is for learning. So that means it's happening while learning is underway, and it helps you to see, is learning happening? How is the learning happening? Are students on task? Are they a little behind? Do they have misconceptions? So the whole purpose of formative assessment is to help you to see where are your students, and then what would your next steps, then you can determine what your next steps might be. You can also give students feedback during a formative assessment because, again, the whole purpose is learning. It's not a grade, it's learning. It's really important to know that formative assessments are not about accountability. It is not about a grade. It's not about, like a gatekeeper kind of thing. It is purely for learning. Now, unfortunately, we do live in a world where we have to give grades. So a grade may be attached to one, but it's not the purpose of it. And that's really important to remember. But on the other hand, summative assessments, that's an assessment of learning, right? So I think of summative as summary, what learning has happened. So that kind of assessment has to happen after that learning is done. And those are used to make those statements of student learning. Did they master it? Did they not? And these are the kinds of assessments that get graded or have some kind of grade. So some examples are like state assessments, could be a local standardized test, but even unit tests, midterms, finals, things like that. It assesses a chunk of learning that has happened. That serves a different purpose, right? Because it's happening after that learning has taken place. So that's a big distinctive between the two. There are 3 different videos, they're very short here, that really talk well about the difference between the two, and they give good examples. So I want you to pause this video for now and watch those 3 videos and then come back to this. Okay, so hopefully you get a good sense of the difference between the two. So now formative assessment. When we think about this, in order for students to grow and to learn and to get better, they need to know a few things, right? They need to know where they're going, like what's their ultimate goal. And then they need to know where they are right now, because that's pretty important, And then they have to figure out how to close the gap. Right? They have to know exactly where they are, where it is that we want them to go, and then how they're going to get there. So that's exactly what formative assessment can do, which these are the 3 questions that are often posted in classrooms because students can own them. Where am I going? Where am I now? How can I close the gap? Right? Think about that language. That's all written in the student's point of view, right? So ultimately, when we think about formative, I'm sorry, my dogs are going to bark. When we think about the difference between formative and summative assessment, ultimately, formative assessment informs your instruction. See what I did there? Formative assessment informs your instruction. That means what you collect from a formative assessment is going to tell you what your next instruction needs to be. So every single lesson has to end with a formative assessment. Otherwise, how do you know whether students met the learning target or not, right? You have to know whether they met it so that you know what to do next, what to do the next day or the next lesson. See what I mean? It's going to help you to see if you need to reteach, or if you can skip ahead, or you might need to give another strategy, or you might need, some more practice. Those assessments are going to tell you what to plan next. That's why every single lesson has to end with a formative assessment. But summative assessments, remember, that's a summary of a larger chunk of learning. So these happen like at the end of a unit. So obviously you are not going to have a summative assessment at the end of every single lesson, right? You'll have a summative assessment at the end of a unit, which could be at the end of, 15, 20 different lessons even. So not every lesson plan will have a summative assessment. Okay? So if we process this information between the two types of assessment, it's important to think about three things, like three different areas that we've talked about. How they impact your instruction. Formative assessment informs your instruction, right? So that information collected literally tells you what to teach the next day. Summative assessments, though, they can't impact your instruction in the same way because the learning's already happened. If you spent, say, 4 weeks on a unit and then you gave a summative assessment and half the class totally bombed it, you're kind of stuck because chances are you've already moved on to the next unit. So they serve different purposes, right? How both look in the instruction assessment cycle. Remember, you're going to plan from data. That data comes from your formative assessments. So when we think about that cycle, it's instruction, formative assessment, planning, instruction, formative assessment, planning. So every time you go around that circle, it's a formative assessment. But you've got to go around that circle multiple times to get to a summative assessment. I hope that makes sense. And then both impact students very differently. Students are very grade driven because, again, that's how our system is set up. So unfortunately, they're driven more by the grade they get on a summative assessment. However, if we are clever and build those formative assessments into what we do in our classroom every day, they are going to impact students more, whether they realize it or not, because it's going to give them the tools they need to learn and grow. Okay, so now it's important to kind of weigh the difference between formal versus informal assessment. So think about it. If I were to say the word test or assessment to you, what do you think of? For me, I think of, sitting in rows, everybody's silent, pencil and paper, can't talk, can't look at other people's papers. I think of like a midterm, a final, a regents exam. That's what I think of when I hear the word test or assessment. But they're actually not one and the same thing. Formal assessments, that's more like tests. Those are, like it sounds, formal. They're administered under those test-taking conditions like I described. So the whole purpose is to collect data, summative data, to determine student performance. And they are very traditional, paper, pencil tasks. So any kind of formal assessment would be a weekly spelling test, end of unit test, midterm, final, all of those kinds of things that I'm sure you've all taken plenty of times, right? Formal. Informal assessments, they measure a student's performance by watching their behavior or using some other informal technique. So with an informal assessment, actually, students don't even realize they're being assessed. They think they're just doing a task or they're doing their classwork, right? The other thing about informal assessments is there's often choice, or you can tailor the activity or the task to students' learning styles and their preferences. So they really do get to show you what they know in a way that makes the best sense to them. So there are so many kinds of informal assessments, but some are debates, any kind of journal entry, teacher observation. A lot of people don't think just observing students' work is assessment. People often think an assessment has to be something students turn in, but that's not true. If your students are working and you are walking around making note of who's making what mistake, who really gets it, who might need some reteaching, that's assessment data, right? Tickets in and out, checklists, all informal assessments. Obviously, there are pros and cons to both, as there are for everything. In terms of formal assessments, they do assess long-term learning, which we do have to do. They're pretty easy to administer and score because they're standardized, and they do prepare students for high-stakes testing. That is just a reality of our world, right? But they're very off-putting, right? Not everybody, but lots of students stress about them, especially poor test takers. It actually hurts them. They're not accurately showing what they know if they're not a good test taker, right? Now, informal assessments, they're ongoing, which is amazing. You constantly have this data to help you plan your instruction. They're also way less obvious. So students aren't intimidated. They aren't anxious, and the data that you collect is much more authentic because students aren't freaking out about taking a test. They're also less for you to prepare, which I think is always a great thing. The cons, it can be difficult to compare data because it's not just plain numbers like you'd get from a formative or a formal summative assessment. But I think the biggest con, to be honest, is difficulty sharing results with parents. Parents want to hear their child's grade. That's how they want to hear how my child is doing in a class, because that's what they know. So unfortunately, parents aren't always as savvy when it comes to sharing informal assessment data. So if you think about which type of assessment you'd use to give you more information to inform your instruction, I hope it's very clear informal assessments are going to give you better data. Informal assessments from formative assessments. I hope that makes sense. If not, drop a comment or a question, in the water cooler. So one more type of assessment to talk about are performance assessments. So this is the most authentic kind of assessment there is because it's based on observation of student work or performance and then judgment about it. So this is where students engage in an activity where they perform a skill, create a product, whatever it might be, and then the teacher judges the quality of the product. So what that does is give you the most accurate portrayal of what students can or can't do, because it's not forcing a different learning style on them. It's literally performing a task that they've been doing and they've been learning. So there are two parts of a performance assessment. The first part is a task. You have to have the task, right? So that's the activity or the exercise that students are going to do. So let's say I'm a science teacher and might be carrying out an experiment in science, like a lab. So then if I have my task, that's important, and it should be aligned to my goals, right? But then I have to have performance criteria. I have to have some kind of basis for judging the quality. And I have to determine that ahead of time. So that way I know, did students meet my expectation or did they not? So let's say for this lab, I wanted to see if students could set up the equipment, collect the necessary information, accurately record their data, and then draw a sound conclusion. Ultimately. So the way I would organize that performance criteria is in a rubric, which I talk about in another video. But that is essentially the most authentic way to assess students because, again, it's like just performing one more type of example of what they've been doing in class or applying all of the learning in a way that makes the most sense. That's not random questions on a test. It's not formal. It's not paper pencil necessarily. Okay, I hope that makes sense, all the different types of assessment. Again, if you're confused about any of them, just leave a question in the water cooler and I will answer it for you.